But once you made the discrimination, there isn't any ambiguity.
Right.
Whereas with the code, there's lots of ambiguity to overcome and assemble and still simulate the real-time flow of...
Right, exactly. I mean, even if the word is on the page all day long, the neural processes that your brain has to go through are still the same. You have to extract out ultimately the sounds from inside the words and learn to put letters to them. And if you have represented those sounds in a fuzzy way, if your brain doesn't really clearly hear these very rapid acoustic onsets that differentiate various speech sounds from each other, then you have represented a much broader pattern of neurons firing together. I mean, what we really need is nice, neat, concise, and effective and efficient. Wham, that's that sound. It's going to fire, and it's going to fire the same pattern every time, or a very similar pattern every time. And so then it becomes something that your brain doesn't have to wait to happen. Now, if you have a broader representation, sometimes it sounds like ba, but sometimes it sounds like da, but sometimes it sounds like ga, which are almost all exactly the same acoustically, except for just tens of milliseconds difference at the onset. Then deciphering out what you've really heard from the context is going to take a lot longer. And therefore, when you come to learn to read, even getting that there are individual sounds inside of words consistently is going to be very difficult. And if your brain has kind of lumped them together, or at least has fuzzy edges between these different boundaries, it's going to be a lot more difficult. Teachers saying this is the ba, this is the letter B, it goes with the ba sound, and your brain sometimes is firing off and hearing ba, but sometimes it's firing off and hearing da. Not surprising, you would end up confusing that ba and da and ga sound. They are visually confusable, but they're also the most acoustically confusable sounds that we have. So there certainly is that whole process going on inside the brain that's not intuitive. And the problem is that it's also not intuitive for many, many teachers. I mean, we learn to talk, and we even learn to read many times without becoming very aware of how we're doing it. Very few of us have any idea how our brain is actually processing the speech sounds. It happens so early in our life, they're just so obvious to us that it's almost like you cannot fail to process them. And the same thing is true of reading. So when you try to reverse engineer the whole thing in terms of, okay, now what's the most effective and efficient way to teach it, that's where we really get into these reading wars. Because different people have completely different ideas of which ways are going to be the most effective and efficient way to teach it. Some people say, well, give them a rich, environment around which to learn to read. Give the child a lot of very compelling books and stories with a lot of language environment, and the child will intuit how to pull out the reading code because it will be so interesting. That's the whole language approach, to give the child a rich language environment full of good literature. Okay. And then there's the opposite point of view. No, you got to teach children very mechanically the letter-sound correspondences. You've got to mechanically teach the child the phonics of the language in order for a child to become a proficient reader. So for the child who can't hear those acoustic signals very well, has very poor phonological representations or fuzzy phonological representations, they probably are going to need that very, very explicit training, but it's also going to be very difficult for them without the context. So of course they really need both. And the child who really has great phonological categories all represented in their brain and also has a good oral language basis and good communicative skills, they come to reading. It really probably isn't going to make any difference at all which way you want to teach those children. They're going to learn to read because they've got such a great neurological and environmental base on which to build the written system. So for those children, which is the vast majority of them, it doesn't matter very much which method. They can be immersed in the reading method, both with phonics and in, the whole language, and they'll do great. It's the kids who are struggling that really one needs to understand more individually what is going on for that child, and then to try to individually adapt the training that's best for them, based on both their strengths and their weaknesses. Now, some people then go and say, well, you really have to teach to a child's strengths. And other people say, no, you have to teach to their weaknesses. And of course, you have to come up with ways of doing both. What we really need to do is understand what's underlying the problems that these children may be having, individual children may be having, and through, in my belief, through the use of technology, which can be much more individually adaptive to the child's learning style, learning pace, underlying learning strengths and weaknesses, can build an individualized program for them to help them learn through all the multiple routes that they might need to become a more effective reader. But I really do believe that all children can learn to read, but they may need, most children need their own pace and their own particular route through the brain that they've developed, through their own environment, to get there. And of course, if English is not their primary language, but that is a language they're going to be asked to learn to read in, that creates a whole other layer in which we're going to want to strengthen the oral language skills, both at the phonological level as well as at the grammatical level and the comprehension level, in order to give a good, solid base on which to learn to read. And that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
Without the oral language proficiency in the native language, particularly in English, to be able to recreate that from the written system, in particular, teaching people to read English that's not their native language, it's a real problem.
Yeah, but we have public schools that primarily are not in the business to teach people how to talk. They're in the business to teach children how to read. So what I think, to a great extent, one of the changes in our society is that there are many more children who are coming to school who really do need a direct approach to improving their oral language abilities and their communication abilities in order for them to become proficient readers. And we just don't have that in most cases. We go right into reading, and in fact, because so many children with oral language weaknesses, I'll call them, be they because the language they're learning at school is not their native language, or because they're one of these many children who, for unknown reasons or for many different reasons, are just weak at oral language skills. Their brain was set up in such a way that it is not as effective in the oral language domain. Those children are going to need more explicit help. They're generally not picked up. They get to school. The first time anyone notices there's a problem is generally when they start to struggle with reading. And therefore, everyone just immediately assumes the problem's reading, and they go right into reading remediation. Very few children are ever seen for a formal oral language evaluation, which in my opinion is a real problem. I think if a child is struggling with reading, that in addition to their reading evaluation, they need an oral language evaluation so that we know where along this whole continuum the child is, and that's where one needs to intercede to begin with, to move along.
So the building blocks are that there's a distinction, an ability to recognize differences in sound, in time, that's important to be able to, in the technology world, they call it the analog to digital converter, right, where we're slicing the analog stream into chunks. So if they're not doing that fast enough, then they don't have the granularity of distinction necessary. Then on the other side of that, once they have that, there's a frequency or speed of processing that's necessary to assemble inside the mind to create the virtually heard stream in the reading process. And any one of these things can cause a bog in processing that causes the stutter that breaks down reading. Right.
I think, hope we can put your words in there. That sounded perfect. That was very good.
Okay.
Right. You certainly got it.